The winter of 1776 had been nothing short of catastrophic for the Continental Army. As the icy winds of December howled across the frozen Delaware River, General George Washington stared into the darkness, knowing that his ragtag force of patriots teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Behind him, barely 3,000 men huddled around flickering campfires, their feet wrapped in bloodied rags, leaving crimson trails in the snow that told the story of their desperate retreat. Across New Jersey, the British forces under General William Howe had systematically crushed every American resistance, driving Washington's army from New York through New Jersey like wolves pursuing wounded deer. Philadelphia, the colonial capital, lay vulnerable just across the river. Many of Washington's own officers whispered of surrender, and the Continental Congress had fled the city in panic. The revolution that had begun with such hope at Lexington and Concord seemed destined to die in the frozen wasteland of a Pennsylvania winter. But Washington possessed something his enemies had not anticipated: the desperate cunning of a man with nothing left to lose. As he studied the intelligence reports from his network of spies, a daring plan began to form in his mind. The British, confident in their overwhelming superiority, had dispersed their forces across New Jersey in winter quarters. At Trenton, a garrison of Hessian mercenaries under Colonel Johann Rall celebrated their recent victories with characteristic German thoroughness, their vigilance dulled by wine and the assumption that no army would be foolish enough to attack in such weather. According to historical accounts documented in David Hackett Fisher's Washington's Crossing, the situation facing the Continental Army in December 1776 represented perhaps the lowest point of American morale during the entire Revolutionary War. The crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, had been a masterpiece of surprise and determination through driving sleet and treacherous ice floes. Washington had ferried his army across the river in the dead of night. The famous victory at Trenton on December 26th had indeed caught the Hessians completely off guard, but Washington understood that this single triumph, while morale-boosting, was merely the first move in a larger chess game. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and unless he could maintain the initiative, his army would once again find itself trapped and destroyed. As news of the Trenton victory spread through the colonies, something remarkable began to happen. Men who had given up hope started to believe again. Militia units that had dissolved began to reform. The fire of rebellion, nearly extinguished, flickered back to life. But Washington knew that hope alone would not win independence. He needed another victory, something more substantial than a surprise raid on hungover mercenaries. He needed a victory that would demonstrate that the Continental Army could stand toe-to-toe with professional British forces and emerge triumphant. The British response was swift and predictable. General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most capable commanders, assembled a force of 8,000 men and marched south from New York, determined to crush this upstart colonial general once and for all. As Cornwallis's columns advanced through New Jersey, Washington realized that he faced the most critical decision of his military career. He could retreat across the Delaware again, preserving his army but surrendering all the momentum gained at Trenton, or he could stand and fight, risking everything on one decisive engagement that would either secure American independence or end the revolution in catastrophic defeat. General Charles Cornwallis had earned his reputation as one of Britain's finest military minds through campaigns in Europe and India, where his tactical brilliance had crushed rebellion after rebellion. As he surveyed the American positions near Trenton on January 2, 1777, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his quarry. Washington's Continental Army, perhaps 4,000 strong, had their backs to the Delaware River with no apparent avenue of escape. The rebel general had made a fatal error, and Cornwallis intended to exploit it with ruthless efficiency. The British commander deployed his forces with methodical precision. His advance guard, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, pressed forward to engage the American outposts while the main body prepared for what Cornwallis confidently expected would be the final battle of the rebellion. The numerical advantage was overwhelming: 8,000 disciplined British and Hessian troops against Washington's mixed force of Continental regulars and militia. Even more importantly, the British possessed superior artillery, cavalry, and the kind of professional military experience that no amount of colonial enthusiasm could match. What Cornwallis could not have known was that Washington had spent the previous weeks transforming his demoralized rabble into something approaching a real army. The victory at Trenton had worked a psychological miracle, but the commander-in-chief understood that miracles alone would not win wars. He had used the brief respite to drill his men relentlessly, improving their marksmanship, bayonet work, and battlefield discipline. More crucially, he had managed to convince many of his soldiers, whose enlistments were set to expire on New Year's Day, to remain with the colors for 6 more weeks. The American position at Trenton was indeed precarious, but Washington had no intention of fighting the battle that Cornwallis expected. As night fell on January 2nd, the Continental Army began one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. While maintaining the appearance of a cornered army preparing for a desperate last stand, Washington quietly moved the bulk of his forces away from Trenton under cover of darkness. The deception was maintained by skeleton crews who kept the campfires burning and made enough noise to convince British sentries that the rebel army remained in position. The target of this nighttime march was Princeton, a small college town 10 miles to the northeast where a significant British garrison had been left to guard communications and supplies. Washington had received intelligence that approximately 1,200 British troops were stationed there, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood. More importantly, Princeton sat astride the main road to New York, and its capture would threaten British supply lines while opening up new possibilities for American strategic movement. The march through the frozen New Jersey countryside tested every man in Washington's army to his absolute limits. The roads were treacherous sheets of ice, and the bitter cold penetrated even the thickest clothing. Many soldiers still lacked proper boots, and their feet left bloody tracks in the snow. The artillery, essential for any assault on a fortified position, had to be dragged by hand when the horses stumbled and fell on the icy ground. Yet somehow, driven by a combination of desperation and newfound confidence, the Continental Army pressed forward through the darkness. As dawn approached on January 3, 1777, Washington's gamble hung in the balance. If Cornwallis discovered the deception too soon, the British commander could easily intercept the American march and destroy the Continental Army piecemeal. If the attack on Princeton failed, Washington would find himself trapped between the British forces with no possibility of escape. But if the plan succeeded, it would demonstrate that the Continental Army could outmaneuver and outfight the supposedly invincible British war machine, potentially changing the entire character of the Revolutionary War. The first pale light of January 3, 1777, revealed a landscape transformed by war and winter. As Washington's army approached Princeton from the southwest, the college town lay quiet beneath a blanket of fresh snow, its colonial brick buildings and bare elm trees creating an almost pastoral scene that belied the violence about to unfold. The Continental Army had marched through the night into columns, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air, their muskets and bayonets glinting dully in the early morning light. Washington had divided his forces to maximize their effectiveness against the British garrison. General Hugh Mercer would lead one column straight into Princeton to engage the main British force, while the commander-in-chief himself would take the larger column around the town to cut off any British retreat toward Trenton. It was a complex maneuver that required precise timing and coordination, exactly the kind of sophisticated military operation that European professionals insisted the colonial amateurs could never execute successfully. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood had awakened that morning with no knowledge of the approaching danger. The British garrison at Princeton consisted primarily of the 17th Foot, 55th Foot, and a detachment of light dragoons, professional soldiers who had served with distinction in previous campaigns. Mawhood himself was preparing to march south with 2 regiments to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton, completely unaware that his intended destination was already empty of rebel forces. The irony of the situation would not become apparent until the sound of musket fire shattered the morning calm. The first contact occurred near the Quaker Meeting House on the outskirts of town, where American advance scouts encountered a British patrol. The sharp crack of muskets echoed across the frozen fields, and within minutes both armies were deploying for battle. Mercer's column advanced across an open field toward a small rise, where Mawhood was hastily forming his men into line of battle. The British commander, despite his surprise, demonstrated the professional competence that had made the King's army feared throughout Europe. Quickly assessing the situation and preparing to meet the rebel assault. What followed was perhaps the most intense and decisive small unit action of the entire Revolutionary War, Mercer's men, advancing with bayonets fixed, showed a discipline and determination that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The British line, anchored by veterans of campaigns in the Caribbean and Europe, delivered devastating volleys that tore gaps in the American ranks for several crucial minutes. The outcome hung in the balance as both sides fought with desperate fury in the snow-covered field. The turning point came when General Mercer himself fell, struck down by British bayonets as he tried to rally his wavering line. The sight of their beloved commander collapsing seemed to break the spirit of the American advance guard, and panic began to spread through their ranks. British dragoons, sensing an opportunity, charged forward with sabers raised, ready to transform retreat into rout. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that Washington's audacious gamble was about to end in catastrophic defeat, potentially destroying the Continental Army and with it any hope of American independence. But Washington had not built his reputation on conventional thinking or predictable tactics. As Mahood pressed his advantage against Mercer's crumbling line, the American commander-in-chief was approaching Princeton from an entirely different direction. With the main body of his army, the British garrison, fully committed to the battle in the southern fields, had no reserves available to meet this new threat. The trap that Washington had so carefully prepared was about to spring shut, but the outcome would depend on whether his untested soldiers could maintain their nerve. In the crucible of close combat against some of Europe's finest professional warriors, Washington's appearance on the battlefield transformed chaos into opportunity. With the dramatic suddenness that marks the greatest moments in military history, as his main column emerged from the woodline north of Princeton, the British forces found themselves caught between two fires. Their carefully prepared defensive positions suddenly rendered worthless. The commander-in-chief, mounted on his white charger and clearly visible to both armies despite the obvious danger, personally led his troops forward with the kind of battlefield leadership that legends are built upon. The psychological impact of Washington's arrival was immediate and profound. American soldiers who had been on the verge of breaking rallied at the sight of their commander, riding directly toward the enemy lines. The Virginia gentleman who had once surveyed wilderness lands and planted tobacco now found himself in the most crucial 30 minutes of American history, his personal courage serving as the catalyst for a military miracle that would be remembered for generations. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his position had become untenable, attempted to execute a fighting withdrawal toward Trenton. The British officer demonstrated considerable tactical skill as he tried to extricate his outnumbered forces. But Washington's army had finally learned to press their advantages. American artillery, commanded by the young Captain Alexander Hamilton, unlimbered their guns with remarkable speed and began pouring deadly fire into the British ranks. The same soldiers who had fled in panic from professional armies just months earlier now advanced with fixed bayonets, their confidence transformed by recent victories and inspirational leadership. The battle for Princeton College itself became a fierce house-to-house struggle that showcased the evolution of the Continental Army, from amateur militia to genuine military force. British soldiers, trained in the formal warfare of European battlefields, found themselves fighting a different kind of enemy in the halls and courtyards of Nassau Hall. American troops, many of whom had grown up hunting in dense forests and fighting Indian raids on the frontier, proved remarkably adaptable to this urban combat environment. Room by room, building by building, they drove the British defenders back until resistance finally collapsed. The victory was complete, but costly. General Mercer's mortal wounding had deprived the Continental Army of one of its most capable commanders, and dozens of other soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow-covered fields around Princeton. Yet the strategic implications of the battle were immediately apparent to every participant. Washington's army had not merely defeated a British garrison. They had outmaneuvered and outfought professional European soldiers using sophisticated tactics and coordinated maneuvers. Military historians, including those cited in the Princeton Battlefield Society's comprehensive battlefield analysis, have consistently identified the engagement at Princeton as the moment when the Continental Army proved it could compete on equal terms with the British military machine. More than the tactical victory itself, the Battle of Princeton demonstrated something that neither the British High Command nor many Americans had believed possible. George Washington possessed genuine strategic brilliance. His decision to abandon Trenton, marched through the night and attacked Princeton, while Cornwallis' pursued ghosts represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking that professional military academies would later study as textbook examples of operational art. The colonial amateur had outgeneraled some of Europe's most experienced officers, using nothing more than audacity, careful planning, and an intimate knowledge of local terrain. As the smoke cleared over Princeton that January morning, both armies understood that the character of the Revolutionary War had fundamentally changed. The British could no longer assume that superior training and equipment guaranteed victory, while the Americans had finally proven to themselves that independence was more than a distant dream. The psychological transformation was as important as any tactical advantage, creating the foundation for everything that would follow in the long struggle ahead. The news of Princeton traveled across the Atlantic world with the speed of 18th century communication, but its impact reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield. In London, Lord George Germain, the colonial secretary responsible for managing the war effort, found himself confronting the uncomfortable reality that his carefully crafted strategy for crushing the rebellion was failing spectacularly. The assumption that a few decisive victories would bring the colonials to their knees had been shattered by Washington's winter campaign, forcing British policymakers to reconsider their entire approach to subduing America. King George III, reviewing reports from his commanders in North America, began to understand that he faced not merely a colonial uprising, but a genuine revolutionary war requiring resources and commitment on a scale that few had anticipated. The monarch's advisors had originally estimated that 20,000 troops would suffice to restore royal authority in the rebellious provinces. Now, with Washington's army demonstrating unexpected resilience and tactical sophistication, it became clear that Britain would need to mobilize resources comparable to those required for a major European conflict. The international implications were equally significant and far-reaching. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes, who had been secretly monitoring American military capabilities, saw in the Princeton victory evidence that the Continental Army might actually be capable of sustained resistance against British forces. This assessment would prove crucial in France's decision to provide covert military aid to the Americans, including the shipments of gunpowder, muskets, and artillery that would keep Washington's army in the field during subsequent campaigns. In the German states, where many of the Hessian mercenaries serving in America had been recruited, news of repeated defeats at the hands of colonial forces began to undermine the professional military reputation that had made German soldiers sought after as mercenaries throughout Europe. The psychological impact on these professional warriors was profound, as they realized that their supposedly inferior opponents were capable of sophisticated military operations that matched or exceeded anything they had encountered in European warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Princeton transformed American public opinion about the war's ultimate prospects. Colonial newspapers, which had been filled with pessimistic reports about British military superiority, suddenly found themselves chronicling a series of remarkable American victories. The Pennsylvania Gazette, published by Benjamin Franklin's former partner David Hall, devoted its entire front page to detailed accounts of Washington's tactical brilliance, helping to create the mythology that would sustain American resistance through the darkest periods of the conflict. The recruitment implications were immediate and substantial. Prior to Princeton, Washington had struggled to maintain an army of 3,000 men, with enlistments expiring and desertion rates approaching catastrophic levels. After Princeton, volunteers began arriving at American camps from throughout the Middle Colonies, bringing with them not only manpower, but also supplies, weapons, and most crucially, the kind of optimistic enthusiasm that transforms military formations from collections of individuals into genuine fighting forces. The economic impact extended far beyond military recruitment. Colonial merchants, who had been reluctant to extend credit to what appeared to be a failing cause, suddenly found themselves willing to supply the Continental Army with everything from uniforms to gunpowder. The transformation was not merely financial, but psychological, as the business community began to believe that American independence was not only possible, but probable, making support for the revolutionary cause a sound long-term investment rather than a patriotic gesture. British strategy in North America would never recover from the psychological shock of Princeton. The comfortable assumption that professional European military methods would inevitably triumph over colonial amateurism had been thoroughly demolished. British commanders would spend the remainder of the war looking over their shoulders, never quite certain when the next unexpected American attack might materialize, never quite confident that their superior numbers and training would guarantee victory in the fluid, unpredictable environment of revolutionary warfare. The true genius of Washington's Princeton campaign became apparent, not in the immediate aftermath of victory, but in the weeks and months that followed as its strategic implications unfolded across the theater of war. The Continental Army's withdrawal to winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey, positioned them in what military strategists would later recognize as one of the most advantageous defensive positions in North America. The Wasatch Mountains provided natural fortification while keeping open lines of communication with the other colonies, effectively creating a base of operations that the British would find impossible to dislodge. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, found his entire strategic framework undermined by Washington's winter victories. The British strategy had been predicated on controlling key population centers and major transportation routes, forcing the Continental Army to either fight decisive battles on British terms or watch helplessly as royal authority was restored province by province. Princeton had demonstrated that Washington possessed both the tactical skill and strategic vision to avoid such unfavorable engagements while maintaining pressure on British forces throughout the region. The logistical implications of Princeton were equally significant and long-lasting. British supply lines, which had seemed secure when protected by garrison forces in towns like Trenton and Princeton, now appeared vulnerable to sudden American attacks. Every convoy required substantial escorts, every depot demanded significant defensive forces, and every communication route needed constant patrolling. The multiplication of defensive requirements stretched British resources to their limits, while providing the Continental Army with numerous opportunities for the kind of small unit actions that had proven so effective at Princeton. Washington's intelligence network, which had provided the crucial information that made the Princeton attack possible, expanded dramatically in the wake of the victory. Local civilians, impressed by American military competence and confident that the rebellion might actually succeed, proved increasingly willing to provide information about British troop movements, supply schedules, and defensive preparations. This intelligence advantage would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns, allowing Washington to choose when and where to engage British forces. On terms favorable to American objectives, the transformation of the Continental Army's reputation extended far beyond the American colonies themselves. European military observers, initially dismissive of colonial military capabilities, began filing reports that portrayed Washington's forces as a legitimate threat to British imperial control. These assessments would prove crucial in diplomatic negotiations as European powers considered whether to support American independence, either through direct military intervention or continued covert assistance. According to comprehensive analysis by the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, the Princeton campaign marked the first time that European military professionals began to seriously study American tactical innovations and strategic thinking. The British response to Princeton revealed the extent to which Washington's victory had disrupted their entire approach to the war. Rather than continuing their aggressive pursuit of decisive battle, British forces increasingly adopted defensive postures designed to protect their existing gains rather than expand royal control into rebel territories. This strategic shift played directly into American hands, allowing the Continental Army to maintain the initiative while avoiding the kind of large-scale engagements that British numerical superiority would have made prohibitively costly. Most importantly, Princeton established the template for American strategic thinking that would guide the revolution. Through its ultimate victory at Yorktown, Washington had proven that the Continental Army could defeat British forces through superior mobility, local intelligence, and innovative tactics rather than attempting to match European military methods. The lesson was clear: America would win its independence not by imitating European warfare, but by developing distinctly American approaches to military strategy that exploited the unique advantages of fighting on familiar terrain. With popular support, the psychological transformation of American leadership was perhaps the most crucial long-term consequence of the Princeton victory. Washington himself gained the confidence that would carry him through the darkest periods of the war, while his subordinate commanders learned that aggressive, innovative tactics could succeed against supposedly superior professional forces. This leadership transformation would prove invaluable in subsequent campaigns. From Saratoga to the Southern Theater, the Battle of Princeton transcended its immediate tactical significance to become one of the defining moments that shaped not only the outcome of the Revolutionary War, but the very character of the American nation that emerged from that conflict. As Washington's army settled into winter quarters at Morristown following their remarkable victory, the commander-in-chief began to understand that he had accomplished something far more important than a successful surprise attack. He had fundamentally altered the strategic dynamic of the entire war, transforming a colonial rebellion into a genuine revolution with realistic prospects for ultimate success. The immediate military consequences continued to reverberate throughout 1777 and beyond. British forces in New Jersey, previously confident in their control of the region, found themselves essentially besieged in their remaining strongholds along the coast. Every patrol became a potential ambush, every supply convoy required substantial escort, and every communication with higher headquarters carried the risk of interception by American forces. The psychological warfare initiated at Princeton had created a climate of uncertainty that would plague British operations throughout the remaining years of the conflict. The international implications proved equally transformative and lasting. French officials, monitoring American military capabilities through their extensive intelligence network, used the Princeton victory as justification for dramatically increasing covert military aid to the Continental Army. Ships carrying French gunpowder, muskets, and artillery began arriving at American ports in unprecedented quantities, providing Washington with the material resources necessary to sustain his forces. Through the challenging campaigns ahead, the Battle of Princeton had essentially served as America's military audition for European support, demonstrating that French assistance would not be wasted on a hopeless cause. The transformation of American military culture represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Washington's winter campaign. The Continental Army that emerged from Princeton bore little resemblance to the demoralized force that had retreated across New Jersey just weeks earlier. Professional discipline, tactical innovation, and most importantly, absolute confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy had replaced the amateur enthusiasm that had characterized early American military efforts. This evolution would prove crucial in subsequent engagements from Monmouth to Cowpens to Yorktown. The political ramifications extended far beyond military affairs, fundamentally altering the relationship between the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. Prior to Princeton, congressional leaders had frequently interfered in military planning, second-guessing strategic decisions and undermining command authority. After Princeton, Washington's reputation for strategic brilliance became so well established that civilian leadership generally deferred to his military judgment, creating the precedent for civilian control of the military that would become a cornerstone of American democratic governance. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress collections demonstrate that foreign observers consistently dated American military credibility from the Princeton campaign, viewing earlier victories as fortunate accidents rather than evidence of genuine military capability. The cultural impact of Princeton on American national identity cannot be overstated in its historical significance. The victory provided concrete evidence that Americans could succeed through intelligence, innovation, and determination rather than relying solely on European assistance or favorable circumstances. This self-reliance became a defining characteristic of American national character, influencing everything from westward expansion to industrial development to 20th century foreign policy. Princeton had proven that Americans could solve their own problems through creative thinking and determined action. The British never fully recovered from the strategic shock of Washington's winter campaign. Every subsequent military operation had to account for the possibility of unexpected American tactical innovation, forcing British commanders to maintain larger defensive forces and adopt increasingly conservative operational approaches. The initiative had passed permanently to the Americans, who would retain it through Saratoga, the French alliance, and ultimately to Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown 5 years later. As the last echoes of musket fire faded across the snow-covered fields of Princeton on that January morning in 1777, few participants could have imagined the full historical significance of what they had accomplished. Washington's army had not merely won another battle. They had proven that a free people, fighting for their independence on their own soil, possessed advantages that no amount of professional military training could overcome. The Battle of Princeton had transformed the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a genuinely revolutionary war, establishing the precedents for military excellence and strategic innovation that would define American military culture for centuries to come. In the frozen fields of a small New Jersey college town, the United States of America had truly been born.